So I'm going to start by looking at the handout for today's class. I'm not sharing my screen, am I? So this is the link for the video I was talking about. And then here's the link for the handout for today's class under week 4. And then on the handout for today's class, I'm going to start off by doing a little bit of review. When you use a template layer in Illustrator, what's the purpose of using a template layer? Melissa, do you remember?
So you can see through to from your design down into it?
Yeah, so actually what its basic purpose is for tracing. So if you want to trace something, you would use a template layer. And then what you're talking about, it gets into question 2, which is what are some of the features of the template layer? And one of the main features, perhaps the most important feature probably, is the fact that you can see the image once you've placed it. If you place it on a template layer when you're in outline. And that becomes important because it means that when we're drawing, you know, let's say we're doing the tracing like you did this week for the portrait, you're going to draw over stuff which is going to cover up things that you need to draw later on. So by being able to toggle backwards and forwards using the keyboard shortcut Command Y, we can see the image underneath it whilst we're tracing, and then toggle back to preview to see it with the color. Question number 3. What key do you hold down to get the hand tool temporarily whilst you're on the pen tool when tracing? So that tracing exercise, to a large extent, was to have you practice using the pen tool. And one of the things in the pen tool is it's useful to learn certain keyboard shortcuts. One of them is the hand tool, like accessing the hand tool temporarily. So you don't have to change from the pen tool to the hand tool and then back again, which wastes time. And also it disconnects from the path. By still staying on the path, we can access the hand tool by holding down which key?
The space bar.
The space bar, there you go. I'm going to go over the tracing process, but I'll leave that for right now. And then adjusting the color overall using a rectangle set of colors. I'm just actually going to review some of this stuff, so these are not really questions. Let me open up that file real quick.
It says hi.
Tell her it says hi.
Hi.
I don't find that. Sorry, I think I had this one ready, but I guess not. Okay. So the main thing I wanted to talk about in terms of reviewing this tracing process is, first of all, when you place the file, remember you want to place it as a template. So we go to File, Place, and this is where you choose to set it as a template. I would generally say that when you're tracing, you want to have link unchecked so that it embeds it. That way you don't have to worry about the file being in the same relative location or anything. Everything's embedded into it. So if you go somewhere else to a different computer, you still have the file with it. And then remember that the purpose of the template is specifically for tracing. That's the idea of the template layer. The other thing that we talked about in relation to this exercise was the layers. The layers in this project, actually, I apologize, are not actually very well organized for this particular demonstration, but the main thing I would suggest when you're setting up the layers for your project is that you break it down into a series of big chunks. So you'd have, like in an image like this, I have one layer which is for the background. I've actually ended up with a background copy, but this layer is just a color overlay on some of the, because I have different artboards where I've adjusted the color, I have some additional layers for doing color adjustments and stuff, which I'll talk about in a second. But mainly, I have layers for the main chunks. So one would be for the shirt, one would be for the skin, one would be for the hat, and so on. I think I'd also talked about the fact that you can add sub-layers in Illustrator. So the layers in Illustrator are a little different from Photoshop insofar as in Photoshop you really have to use layers. You don't really have any choice because if things are touching each other in Photoshop on the same layer, they merge together. Whereas in Illustrator, every single object that you draw has its own level within the layer automatically. When you draw an object, the last thing you draw is above anything else that's on that particular layer. So if you open up the layer by clicking on this arrow, you'll see that this has two objects inside of it, this rectangle and this path. If I open up this layer at the top, you can see that it's got a clipping group, and then inside there it's got the clipping path and some color, and then it's got the clipped object, and then there's a bunch of objects inside of there. So the layers in Illustrator are kind of like a filing system. They're a way of organizing stuff so that you can lock certain layers, so that when you're working on stuff, like let's say I'm working on the glasses, I can have all of the other layers locked so that I don't accidentally move something and so on. So one of the aspects of this assignment was to talk about the use of layers. Remember that you can use sub-layers. So on certain layers here, let me see. I think probably perhaps on that. I've kind of, I should set up I think what I'll do is I'll set up a separate file that has the layers a little bit organized, more organized, so I can show you this better. But basically within a particular layer, you could add a sub-layer. So for instance, on the face, I might have an overall layer, which is for the face itself, and then have another one for all of the detail. Excuse me. However you organize that is up to you. There isn't necessarily a right or wrong way of doing it. I think I've talked to you about the fact that Chris Nielsen, who teaches the 181 class, who I have a lot of respect for as an instructor, actually has students do a lot of layers, lots and lots of layers. So almost everything is on a separate layer. Whereas I tend to keep it much less layers to really kind of break it down into big chunks, and then maybe have some sub layers in there. In my actual practice, when I work myself, I actually quite often don't use layers in Illustrator. I just you have everything all on one layer, and then I lock things and hide things and go into outline mode to allow me to select things. I might separate things onto different layers if I'm going to give it to a client, or I think that somebody else might be working on it, so it's easier for them to understand the file. Or if I'm talking about it, it is a good practice to get into, like naming layers and organizing things in such a way which is logical, because you do, as a creative person, end up having to work with other people, and sometimes somebody else may have to work on your file. So making it easy to understand for somebody else can be useful in that way. But like I said, it's not essential in Illustrator to use layers. You could do everything all on one layer if you wanted to. The only thing which would be important here is that you would really want to have a template layer for tracing, and then you could trace everything else on top of that. And then the other thing we talked about in this exercise was the use of the pen tool. So just to recap a couple of things to remind you about using the pen tool. The reason that this exercise is such a good practice for using the pen tool is that there's obviously a lot of work to be done to create a kind of detailed representation of something which is photographic with the pen tool. And then there's a few things to bear in mind. One of them is that as you're working with the pen tool, you generally want to use as few points as possible. So you add a point wherever there's a change in direction. So if you think of it as like a series of hills and valleys, like even on something like this, or on the side of the face, if you think of this as going, if we turned on its side, if you imagine turning it horizontally, this is at the bottom of the valley, and then you're at the top of the hill and you're bottom of the valley. If you select this, you can see that I've got a point here, sort of at the top of the hill, then one down here, and then one down here at the bottom. So generally speaking, wherever there's a change in direction is where you're adding the points. The reason you want to keep it to as few as possible is it's easier for you to edit. It also reduces the file size. So Illustrator files are made larger by having more anchor points, but it's more to do with the look of it. So when you're working on it, if you have too many points, it'll start to look very jagged. You know, so down here where I want it to look jagged in the beard, I've got lots of points. And I might, even if I wanted to make it more detailed, go in and add some additional points like this. So I've got the path selected. With the pen tool, I can add points by putting my cursor over the path. And then holding Command, remember, will give me the last selection tool. And then I can move points around to add to this. So I can add 3 points. take the middle point and pull it up to make a point inside of them. The other thing when you're working with the pen tool that's kind of useful to remember is those keyboard shortcuts. So as you're working, you're probably going to want to be zoomed in so that you can do this accurately. And so as you're drawing, you're going to run out of space. So up here, for instance, let's say I was going along my way drawing a path, and I get to here and I want to continue. I can hold the space bar, and I've got the hand tool, and I can drag down and continue on my way. If I hold Command, I get the last selection tool, which if I use the direct selection tool previously, I can then easily move points around, and I can move handles around to reposition the path. As soon as I let go, I can just continue drawing. The other thing I looked at in this exercise was how you could go about changing the color afterwards. So on this one, I had the initial tracing is this one right here, which is not an exact copy of the color, by the way, in the photograph. This is the photographic image. If I do Command Y, you can see it. It's pretty close though. So I did eyedropper the color initially, and then I've adjusted the color myself to make it sort of feel more natural, actually. And then the next ones are basically making a duplicate of this illustration and then playing around with color to make a more interesting or more unusual color representation. So on this one, for instance, if I select it, first of all, at the top, there is a rectangle that I select, but if I drag it out of the way, you can see that this is changing the tonal value of this. It has an opacity of 42, and then it's set to color burn, which is a blending mode. So I've got this color, this sort of turquoisey color. You can see it up here, perhaps easier in the control bar. That's the color that I'm laying over the top of it. Need Command Z to get out of there for a second. So you can see that if I hide that by doing Command 3, the color of the image changes quite a lot. The other way I can adjust the color is if I select over everything, and then I go up here in the top in the control bar and click on this Recolor Artwork, we get to this dialog box. In this dialog box, I would go to Edit right here, and then we get the color wheel. And if I link all of these colors together so that when they move together, I can adjust the saturation. So you can see now that the color becomes much more intense. If I go this way, it'll become less intense, it'll become less saturated. I can also make all of the colors together lighter or all of the colors darker. By the way, you'll notice that when I go this here, all of the black stays as black. If you have something that's 100% black, it's not going to shift when you lighten it. Let's bring that back down again. You can also adjust the hue though, so you can drag across like this to adjust through to a completely different set of colors. You're basically just sliding around the color wheel. But I think that one of the things that's great about that is that it allows you to take this illustration, which is made out of thousands of objects basically that you've drawn, and then shift the color to something which is maybe more natural or maybe stranger to give it an emotion. The color has a lot of emotion in the illustration. So by shifting the color, we change the feeling of it quite drastically. So that was the review part of the class. Let's go back to the handout for a second. So one of the things I want to do today is introduce the next project. I can't remember actually if last week I talked about this. Did I talk about the character design project at all in the Wednesday class? So the next project is the character design project, and you're going to create a character. You're going to create a set of 4 characters, and I'm giving you 3 names, and then you're going to come up with the last name. So the first 3 names: Skeeter, he's a middle-aged stoner skater punk. who takes it chill, likes to hang with his buds and plays his bass. Agnes is a cantankerous old woman, gritty, funny, and has a bit of a potty mouth for someone in their 80s. And then Zombie Bunny, blank, numb, dead for all intents and purposes, maybe a little smelly too. So I'm giving you a name and a little description. What I would like you to do for the fourth one is come up with another name and come up with another line of description. And then you're going to build characters based off of that. So what I wanted to do in today's class is talk a little bit about how you can go about starting this. There's on the handout up for today's class, there is a bunch of links which relate to this. So first of all, there's some character design references here. If I click on this. Oh, this is actually the wrong link. So it's not loading quick enough, maybe. Right. Try the next one. So I've got the links open here anyway, they're on there. So let's just go through some of them. There's a couple of links which are examples of character designers' work. So this is one example right here. And if you click on this section, actually, this is really his character design. So this is somebody who's an illustrator and a character designer. But if you go into this section here, it's all just his character design. And one of the things that's kind of nice about this page is he shows some examples, but it also shows the process. So here, he's got some basic sketches. These are just focusing on the shape. Then he's got some sketches that show the first poses for the characters, and some second poses. Then he goes into showing the colored versions of the characters, and then there's some other examples of the work there. This next one is another example of a character designer. This is a very famous character designer, Robert Ryan Corey, who designed many of the SpongeBob characters. That's what he's perhaps most famous for, but he's done a lot of work over the years. Very famous character designer. And this is a great page as well. This is just on his Flickr page, but it really shows you the kind of creativity and the expressive nature of his work, the use of color, the shapes, the line. He has a very unique and expressive sort of style. So this is just inspiration, really, give you some idea. There's also a link to an article about what character design is and how character designers create characters. One of the first things that it talks about in here is somewhere down here. It talks about silhouette. So this is what I'm going to focus on in today's class, a good silhouette here. So there's various points that he talks about in terms of character design. Focus on your subject's idea, then the character itself, developing the character. Then it talks about the silhouette, and then it talks about posture and so on. I'm not going to read through this right now, but you can read over this article. This gives you a good kind of general overview about what character design is, and also what to think about when you're designing a character. And I'm going to focus on this one thing to begin with, which is a good silhouette. There's also a link to this documentary about Carlos Grangle, who's a well-known character designer. And then there is a link here to some character designs. This is just a link on Behance to character design as a subject. So it gives you lots and lots and lots and lots of inspiration for designing characters. It goes on forever pretty much. Okay, let me go back to the handout for a second. So these are the links at the bottom of the handout, okay? And then if we go through here, I've written a little thing here about silhouettes. I'm just going to go over this for a second, and then we'll look at some more examples of it. When creating characters, one of the most important things to be aware of is its silhouette. A successful character needs to be instantly recognizable by its shape. If you look at the examples on this page, I would guess that you could name most of the characters shown here, maybe all of them, depending on your knowledge of cartoon characters. Take Mickey, for instance. His silhouette is very distinctive to a large extent due to his large round ears. He's quite far removed from the silhouette of an actual mouse. For one thing, as it's often the case for animals in cartoons, Mickey is personified by adding clothes and having him stand up. Cartoons are a simplification and abstraction of reality rather than representational. The ability to simplify, stylize, and abstract is an essential aspect of becoming a visual artist. So if you look at these characters, I know that they're kind of small, but I think with most of them, you can probably guess who they are. So this is Mickey Mouse, obviously. This is Daffy Duck. Fred Flintstone. This is Bart Simpson. Here's SpongeBob SquarePants. Felix. So you go down there, they're all pretty instantly recognizable, almost like a logo. Like when we're doing those symbols, we talked about the way that there are means of communication, right? And we need to be able to instantly recognize them. Cartoon characters are similar in that regard. They're something which cartoon characters are used by storytellers as a vehicle to help tell a story, but then visually that character needs to be something that we can latch onto and be able to recognize very easily in a given situation. If you notice on most of these, they're not very realistic. They're abstractions of reality. Mickey doesn't look like a mouse. Fred Flintstone doesn't really look like a middle-aged bloke exactly. He's got a lot of similarities to it, but they're abstracted, they're modified, they're distorted. There's certain aspects of the character as well which are usually exaggerated to help us to understand what type of character it is. So for instance, if somebody's supposed to be strong, they've got really, really extra broad shoulders kind of thing. If they're kind of thuggish, you know, their head is perhaps squashed down into the shoulders and their neck is almost invisible. There's certain aspects of the character's personality which needs to be reflected by the shapes alone. So one way to start a design as a character designer, in fact, oftentimes character designers start designs in this way, is beginning simply by using a silhouette. It helps you get to this to the basic idea, and also it's an important aspect of it. That relationship of negative and positive space again, just the same thing we talked about with the symbols project, is relevant here as well. You know, the space between different aspects of the character, between the legs, between the arms, all of that sort of stuff is important. So oftentimes you would begin with drawings that are kind of like this. This is a great example of just using a brush and wash to come up with some silhouettes. It doesn't have to be done in Illustrator to begin with. You're going to do sketches for this. Maybe some of the sketches could be done with a brush to give you a more fluid kind of approach to it.
That way of painting is looking blurry and fuzzy.
Yeah, so this is just to get an idea though. Don't forget that, Jordan. These are not the finished things. These would just be to get an idea of the shape that we're going for.
I know, it looks interesting to me.
Yeah, I like them. They're cool, yeah. Here's some other examples of silhouetted shapes. And you can see how the character can evolve from these blobby shapes into something. These are more just kind of examples. These are done with a marker. You can see how the artist is scribbling out the shapes. These ones are more clarified. They're like more finished drawings. But you can see the focus on the silhouette and the way that we can see the character and the dynamics of the character just from the pose and the shape and so on. Here's some examples of very simple character. These are the silhouettes. I don't know whether you guys have seen the animated movie Coraline. If you haven't seen it, I'd highly recommend it. It's a movie which is a stop motion type animation.
I've seen the movie.
Do you like it, Jordan?
Yeah, I guess so.
Uh-huh. Do you like stop motion animation?
Don't know what that is. Is that like claymation?
Well, claymation is a form of stop motion, yeah. So when they do the Coraline, they have these figures that are like puppets, right? And then they move them, kind of like Tim Burton's movie that he did. I've forgotten the name of it now.
The Nightmare Before Christmas?
Nightmare Before Christmas. It's like you have these puppets that you move very slightly, then you take a photograph. Then you move it very slightly, then you take a photograph. Then you move it very slightly and take a photograph. And eventually you play all of those photographs together as a piece of film, and it looks like it's moving. So with these are the basic shapes for those characters within those movies. So these are more simplified than the actual characters, because the characters are actually, as I said, they're puppets. But this is a sketch that shows the overall silhouettes of the different characters in relationship to each other. This is something I stole, which I like the presentation of this, but it gives you a good description of why you would draw with silhouette thumbnails. So one of the most useful techniques for getting your brain generating endless design variations is the silhouette thumbnail. A silhouette thumbnail is a quick way to establish the overall form of your design and see if it reads well before we set to all of this. So before you get to a detailed version, you start off with a silhouette. And we think of this in terms of character design, but it actually could work with anything, like plants or buildings or any other aspect of design. So here's the process. Start with black. If you're doing it digital, then you add some gray, then you add some white. You've got your 3 tonal values then. So you have something which represents form. Here's a suggestion. You start off with a random shape, and then you add some contour lines, and you add some other details, and see what you end up with. It'll allow your imagination to kind of flow. So when we see a shape, we tend to try to interpret it automatically. Our brain is sort of designed to do that. So if we see a black silhouetted shape, what is that black silhouetted shape? So maybe you see it as like a fat person sitting down reading a book. Then maybe somebody else reads it as like, that it's somebody holding a cat. Maybe somebody else reads it as a jug. It's like you see it for what it is, and you modify the shape to fit to what you want it to actually fit like exactly. So that's just a suggestion. And then there's some other examples. These are all by the same artist, except for this last one. Actually, I put this one in just because it gives you an idea of this is from a sheet from the movie, and gives you an idea of the way that the character is developed. Again, starting with black and white sketches, rough sketches, and then gradually adding detail later on. So those are all examples that are on the handouts for today's class. I'm going to do an exercise which, as I said, there's a video for this already on Canvas in the modules section, but I'll go through it again quickly here as well. The idea of this is it's based off of traditional life drawing, actually. If you've ever done life drawing classes, you may well have experienced this, where the life drawing instructor will start the class by having you do a series of fast poses. These are usually referred to as gestural drawings. So the model may stand in the same position for only, say, 30 seconds or a minute or 2 minutes. And you have to quickly get down what the gesture is. So you'll put a curve for where the spine is, and where a line for where the hips is, a line for where the shoulders is, and where the arms are, and so on. So this initial line, you can kind of think of as like a gestural line. The idea of this line is just to kind of show basically where the leg is positioned. And you could use this same technique for a leg, for an arm, for a tentacle, for any kind of like appendage on the body. You might even use it for the body itself, actually. So if I did this leg, I could start off by click. This is with the pen tool. Click and drag, so we create a little bit of a curve. Not too much, but a little bit for the shape of the thigh. And then with the knee, I'm going to click to remove that trailing handle. And then I'm going to click again to create the bottom part of the leg, which is the calf. And then click again to make the foot. So that's the shape of the leg that I want to have. Obviously, this could be any shape. So, if I was doing an arm, maybe I've got an arm that's up, and they've got the top of the arm here, and then we go to the bottom of the arm here. And then for the hand, maybe he's got it sort of cupped over. So you could have something like that, And if you wanted to, you could add the shoulder into it. But you'd start off with just a sort of gestural line, which indicates the position of the part of the body, the limb, for want of a better word. And so, like, just to give you a better idea of what I'm talking about here, like if I put the hips in and then a line for the other leg, we can get a sense of how the figure is actually standing without having to put a lot of time and effort into figuring out the details of the drawing. We just get a basic position of how the leg is going to be. So if I want to flesh this one out now, what we can do is we can start by taking this path, add some thickness to the stroke. I'll get rid of the fill altogether. And then on the stroke, remember that we can round off the caps. One of the things I wanted to focus on actually in today's class was the stroke panel. So whilst we're at it, let's take a look at that stroke panel. If I go to Windows Stroke, here I need to go to the pull down to do show options so they can see the whole panel. But there's a few things to be aware of in the stroke panel. So first of all, we've got the cap, which we just looked at. I think most of you are probably aware of that by now. We can have a butt cap, that's the default position. You could have a rounded cap, and you can also have an extended or projecting cap that looks like that. So here I'm rounding off. I use this quite a lot with character design illustration, that type of illustration, to kind of soften the end of the stroke so it doesn't look quite as mechanical. You can also do the same thing with the corners. So like for the knee and the ankle here, we could round those off as well. Underneath that, we have a line stroke. So you could align stroke to the inside or the outside. Now, in this case, as it's an open path, that doesn't really work. But if I had a circle here, I could have the path go inside the stroke, inside the path, or I could have the stroke go outside the path. So the path itself, if we look at it in outline mode, is there, right? So now it's extending outside of it. Now it's going either side of the shape, and that's the default position. But sometimes that doesn't really work because of how it connects with another shape. So being able to flip to the inside or the outside is sometimes very useful. Because bear in mind, like let's say I made a shape and I wanted it to be exactly 3 inches by 3 inches. I could type in 3IN, because right now I'm in points. So 216 points is 3 inches. And I might want to have a square which is exactly 3 inches, but I want to have a black stroke around the outside. Well, now it's more than 3 inches because it's got a stroke around the outside of it, which is extended. But if I set it to be on the inside, now the square is exactly 3 inches with that stroke now on the inside of the shape. The other thing you can do with a stroke is we can set it to be a dashed line. And we looked at this when we were doing the symbols project as well. So you can extend out how big the dash is. If you make it a very small amount, like 0.1, and then you set up a fairly large gap between these, so maybe 20 points, you can see now that it shows up as a series of circles. If I set it to 40 points, it would look like it's got a gap in between each one. You can also have a dot dash kind of thing, semaphore. So I could make this one say 3. Now we would have one which is like that. Let's have this be 20. So now you've got this staggering effect where one of them is a circle, one of them is a dash. Let's make the dash a little bit bigger. So you can do all kinds of things with these dashes and dots and stuff. And then don't forget that if you played with that in relationship to the appearance panel, so let me simplify this a little bit. I'm going to get rid of this and that. So all we've got is the dots. And let's apply this to a circle because I think it'll look better for what I'm trying to do here. So if we went into the appearance panel now, don't forget that you can duplicate the stroke. So if I duplicate the stroke here and then make this one smaller, let's make this one 10 points. And then let's change the color of this one to red. So now we've got a red dot inside of that black circle. And if we duplicate the stroke further, make another duplicate of that stroke inside here, and we'll make this one 5 points. And then set this one to white. Now we have a series of red, white, and black dots that are all sitting right over the top of each other. So going back to the stroke panel, we got that option. You also have this option for arrowheads. I'm not sure if you realize this, but if you have a path, however you've created it, and you select it, you can add an arrowhead to the end of it. And you can add it to both ends of it, actually. Or if you only wanted it on one end, if you applied it to one end and you actually wanted it on the other end, you could reverse it by clicking here. You can also scale the amount of that. So you could have it be smaller. Oh, actually, sorry, on this side. I could make it smaller. I was trying to do this side, but this one is associated with this arrowhead. So if this one had an arrowhead, I could have this one be bigger and that one be smaller. And then down here, we can also adjust the profile within the stroke panel. And again, you could reflect this. Let me take this off so you can see this better. And then let's change this one to one that has a direction. So you could also reflect the angle of that also. So there's quite a lot you can do in the stroke panel in terms of modifying shapes or changing the shapes of things in kind of subtle ways at least. Okay, going back to this demonstration. So we've got this leg, we're looking to add a little bit. And now we want to give it more of a sort of sense of form. Now, this depends on your character, of course. It might be that you want to have a character where it's very simple. And in early characters, there was a type of character design style called hosepipe, where the characters had just basically like rubber tubes for arms and legs. So you might just want to keep it like that, which is basically the same thickness all the way down. But if you wanted to give it some more form, we could use the width tool and we could add some more width to this. So remember with the width tool as well, if you hold Option, you can drag from just one side. So I could drag this out and then I could drag this back in again there. And then I could drag this out here and drag it back in again right here. And that way we can start to create a sense of form with the leg. Now, in some areas, it doesn't work quite as well as I would like. Like here, the roundness on the foot gets really exaggerated when I do that. But it gets me pretty close to what I want. It gives me a start. Now what I can do is if I go to Object, Expand Appearance, it gives me more control to modify the shape of this. By the way, if we'd still had a fill inside of this stroke, even though we couldn't see it, because it would be colored. Let's say you had a white fill, which we couldn't see. When you expand it, it also expands that. So if you look, there's a stroke in the middle. And if you were to look at it in transparency, show transparency grid, you can see that there's a white shape there. You can just delete that one. Okay, the other thing you may notice whilst we're in outline mode is that this shape, where it overlaps, has created these weird sort of like crossovers. And those can cause problems. So let's get rid of that by using the Pathfinder panel and uniting it. Now you can see that those parts where they overlapped have disappeared. The other thing you may notice is that there is a lot of anchor points. Oftentimes when you expand something, it creates a lot of anchor points. So I'm going to go to Object, Path, Simplify. And then usually the default position for this works fairly well, but you can adjust this so it's even more simple or not quite as simple. As it's simplifying it, obviously it's modifying the shape slightly, but at that point it isn't really changing it significantly. I've basically got what I still wanted, but I've got a lot less anchor points, which means that it's easier for me to edit it. If I have a lot of anchor points, to try and move this part of the leg in, I've got to select all of those anchor points and try to move them relative to each other. Whereas here, I can just select this one anchor point and I can pull it over a little bit. Maybe I need to move this one as well a little bit, but I don't have as much to control. So I'm going to modify the shape a little bit more. So one thing I could do is let's select the end of this and scale it. So I'm going to choose the scale. So I'm going to scale it by 99% and then do Command D.
Professor, can I ask a question?
Sure, yeah.
What is the difference between that little anchor point that's a little square and it's, you know, there's nothing in it, and the actual blue ones?
So like here, for instance,
Yeah.
this one's white, right?
Yeah, and the other ones are blue.
This one's blue. Yeah, so the difference is that when an anchor point is selected, it will appear as solid. But if it's not selected, so this anchor point is not selected, if I was to drag, I'm only dragging that one
I
point.
see. But in the former screen,
Uh-huh.
in the yeah, I got it. I think I understand. The former screen, you had all these little blue anchor points all over the place, but the one in the in the fold of the foot was white. So that's why I was asking. Thank you.
Like right here, maybe I
Yeah.
had, it was like that one was deselected.
That one was what deselected, yeah, and the other ones were all blue.
Yeah, so these ones are all selected now, this one's not. So if I was to move it, that one's actually going to stay where it is.
Ah, okay. Okay, now I understand. Thank you. That
Sure.
I did not know that. Thanks.
But now I'm getting the shape closer to what I want. This is another useful tool. Hidden with the scale tool, there's a tool called the reshape tool, which if I select all of these points, I think I've shown you this before, but I'm not sure. If I drag this, I'm dragging that one point, but all of the other points that I have selected are dragging relative to it. So the difference is if I was to take just that one anchor point and move it, the other points would all stay where they are. Do you see that? Whereas if I select all of those points, I can drag those like that, those points, but they're not relative to these other ones. Whereas the shape, this tool here, I can drag these and they're all moving relative to the foot itself. Okay, so now I've got the shape pretty close to how I want it. At least for the purpose of this demonstration, this will work, okay? So I've got it adjusted how I want to adjust it. I'm going to take off a couple of points here so that we simplify this slightly. Have this go to there. Okay, so now I've got to this point. Let's turn off the hide transparency grid. Now that I've got the leg to this point, I'm going to change it back so that it has a black stroke and a white fill. And let's actually give the leg some color. And let me change the stroke thickness a little bit. So remember that we started off with something which was a stroke, and then we thickened it, and then we modified it with the width tool, and then when we expanded it, it turned into this filled object. So one of the advantages of turning it into a filled object is that now we can add a stroke around the outside of that. And so now what I can do as well is I can go to Object, Expand, and expand that stroke as well. So now what we can do is we can take this point and pull it down here. This creates just this tiny little overlap there, which gives an indication of this leg being in front of this part of the body. I think this part of the body is a little bit too long, so I'm going to bring this up a little bit. I just selected the anchor points and then dragging those anchor points up. Do that again. Okay, that's okay. And then I could do the same kind of thing here. So down at the bottom here, there's a point. I'm just going to drag that into there. Now, if you didn't have a point there that you could grab, you could always make a point to move, you know? And you can also modify these shapes. So this part right here, I might want to soften it by rounding that off a little bit. But then it gives you this impression that this leg is coming in front of that foot a little bit. Does that make sense? And you could add other details, but that gives you a basic starting point. Here now, if I wanted another leg, I could use the rotate tool, click on the hip, drag it this way, and now he's running. The other thing we might want to do is to add shading to it. So if I wanted to shade the leg, one way to do this is to draw a shape over the surface where you think the shadow is going to come from. So let's say my light source is coming from this direction. So the light would be on the top here. The area behind here, underneath, or behind the leg, would be in shadow. So I'm going to draw a shape where I think that the shadow will come. So let's say afterwards, I'm going to put some shorts on this to make it a little bit more decent. I'm going to draw a shape across here. This will be for the shadow from the short. And then we'll go down here, add a little bit around the back of this. I'm also going to go underneath the knee right here, and then back up. And then we'll go back down this area right here, around the bottom of the foot. And then I can go outside of this one. So just go all the way around the outside of the leg now to complete it. Once I've got that point, so I can see what I'm doing better, I'm going to lower the opacity here. And also this is going to end up being a shadow. So let's just change the blending mode to multiply. And then it will darken that color with the black. You could even use this actual color and change the blending mode on that to multiply. And that's a good way to work with shadow. So now with the leg selected, the only bit I need to have selected actually is the color on the inside, so this bit, and then the color on the outside, that bit. And then if I use the sheet builder tool, I can hold Option and click on the outside edge, and now we've got all of the shadow form. Then we can put the shorts outside of that. Shorts. But for right now, I'm just going to keep it simple and do those blacks, so just so that we've got an idea. But you see how that kind of creates now? Now this feels like it's something which has dimension to it. It feels like something which is sort of three-dimensional. His top of his thigh ended up a little bit skinny, but you know, that's the general idea of how to kind of go about it. I'm not saying that you have to do it this way. I'm just saying that this is a suggestion. You know? So let's say you're doing some kind of an animal. Let me make another artboard here. And then on this artboard, I'm going to draw a path that I could use as, say, a tentacle. I recently did a character, actually. Well, actually, I didn't recently do it, but I did a redo of a character that I'd done a couple of years ago, which was a Kraken-type character with tentacles. It was for an event which ended up getting cancelled because of the COVID. But it was the Microsoft did this thing every year called the Hackathon, which is where about 40,000 coders from around the world come to Vegas, and they have like a big party and work on coding things, and it's a big elaborate affair. And they have these various characters that I've helped them design over the past, I don't know, 4 years maybe, that they use for those events. And one of them is this Kraken. So the nice thing about this is that I could use a path like that to give myself the basic shape. So rather than drawing it, I could draw it with I could draw the path, which is the direction of the tentacle. And then I could make something which fits that shape and make it into a shape profile. So this shape profile is actually pretty close to what I want, but it's not quite right. So let's modify one. Let's make our own shape profile. Let's say I draw a shape like this, and I'll just use that for right now to get me close enough. And then let's take this off. So I want it to be roughly like that, except that I'm going to expand the appearance on this, and then I'm going to modify the shape a little bit more. So I want it for the tentacle to be a little bit more curved. So I'm going to take the anchor point tool, and I'm going to pull this out on the side slightly, and pull it out on the side here slightly. And then at the end, I'm going to round this end off a little bit. So we can't make this into a shape profile because it's not a path. It's a filled object as the shape that I want. But what I could do is make this into a brush. So if we went to the brushes panel, and then we drag this shape. So actually I want to rotate this the other way. Let's rotate it like that. And we're going to make this into an art brush. And then press OK. And then press OK again. And then if I select this and choose this brush, you can see I have pretty much the same thing, but now I've been able to modify it so it's closer to what I really want. And now because I have that, for all the other tentacles, I could basically just keep that brush selected. If we go to Window, go to the Appearance panel, and in the Appearance panel, make sure that New Art has Basic Appearance is turned off. Now, every time, if I have this selected, every brush, everything I draw will then have that brush associated with it. So we can add all of the tentacles just like that. And if you want to modify them further individually, we could expand them, just like we did with the leg. Maybe go to Path and simplify them a little bit so that they're easier to modify. And then we can go in here and we can add a stroke over it. And we could adjust that stroke, just like we were doing with the leg. And you could attach it to a body by doing something like this. If we want to make these feel like they blend into the body, what we can do is get rid of this end path right there, move this path, and change the angle of the curve so that it feels like it's going into it. You see how that now feels like it's kind of growing out of the shape rather than it being stuck on top of it? So, but we have to expand it to be able to do that because we need to be able to get rid of that end of the object. We need to make it into a filled object, which has got a path on it. Now that path has got a shape profile, which is fading out, but it's a bit too much from that position. We'll look at other ways of doing that. You could also have it fade out here by going to Object, Expand. Remember that when we expand this, we lose some ability to edit it in other ways. But here, it means that I can now make this fade out. And I can go to this one, and we can make this one fade out. So this one's got an extra anchor point here that I don't need. I'm going to add one at the top here to hold this one in place, and then delete that one so that my fade is more like how I want it to go.
Wow.
And you might... What did you say, Jordan?
You thinned the tops of those lines.
Yeah, I just thinned them out. So I've made them into filled objects now. Right? So it looks like there's 3 lines here, but remember that there's a fill in the middle. That's just the color.
Yeah. What I mean is they used to be squared, but you...
Yeah, and I faded it off. So because I made this into a fill, I can then taper this. If it was just a path, I could do it, but it would be, I'd have to do it in a different way. And because it was so far away, you know, all this whole distance, to use the shape from up here didn't really work. So that's why I expanded it. Another way that we could do it though is like this, just to give you another option. This allows you to keep it as a stroke and keep it editable. Instead of expanding it, we could use the width tool. And at the end here, I would add a bit right here. So I click with the width tool and retain it. Like right there, retain the width the same as it is. And then at the end here, I can pull it in. And now we've got the same effect, but it's still actually a stroke. So one of the advantages of this is that later on, let's say I needed to come back in here and adjust the stroke of these. This one would be a little tricky because it's a fill now. It doesn't really have a stroke there. But this one I could go back and I could change the stroke. I could still go back in here and edit the stroke width. even though I've changed the width of those endpoints. Does that make sense? So that's all related to each other. This idea is, I did it as a leg, but I wanted to show you that the fact that you can easily use that and translate it into anything which is basically an appendage or a limb. So it could be a tentacle, or it could be a tail on an animal, or it could be an arm, or it could be a leg, or what have you. You know what I mean? But it's just a way of creating a shape from a directional line, from a line which is giving you a sense of motion or form. Okay. All right, the next thing I wanted to talk about is starting the character design simply as silhouettes. So I've got a couple over here which I've got started just to show you as a process. So there's one, just using squares, rectangles and stuff to form a figure, and then starting to modify. This one is also made in the same way. So it starts off with circles and rectangles and so on. And then I've modified it to end up with the finished horse shape. Same with this guy. He's starting off with some basic forms. Actually, this one I did quite similar to that last one. So the arms and legs are done as paths, which are thickened and then modified. And then the inside is just a rectangle, which has been distorted. The head was just an ellipse, and then I've added stuff to it. So I'd like to do a little bit of a demonstration where we start by creating a character with just silhouettes. And then on this one, what I want to do is show you how once you've got that basic silhouette, you could start adding form to it, adding color and shading and stuff like that. So I think in today's class, I'll just get as far as focusing on the silhouette part of it. And then, because I also want to talk about sketching in Photoshop, or sketching on an iPad, or sketching by hand for this assignment. But I wanted to talk a little bit about creating silhouettes. So the idea of this is that, as I said at the beginning when we were looking at those examples, the silhouette is a good way to start, but it's also something which is useful to understand, like in the final result of the character, that the character should end up with a strong silhouette, something which is unique to that character, you know, something that really makes it stand out as different from something else. So if I was to make a character, I'm going to start from scratch and just make something up as I go along. One of the suggestions on the handout is something that I'd stolen, which was a drawn thing. At the very end of the handout, it talks about just starting with a random shape and then seeing what you can build out of it. So let's say you just kind of draw a random shape, like something like this, and then you make that a solid silhouette. And then you think, what does that suggest to me? So for me, this sort of suggests somebody that's kind of maybe in a cape or some kind of robe, like a monk or something like that. I think it's this part right here. And I could sort of build off of that. So maybe we could build off of it by adding some legs at the bottom and some feet. So maybe the feet, I'll instead of using a rectangle, I'll use a triangle. And then I also want to add, I'm going to modify this shape a little bit. I'm going to unite all of this together so it becomes one shape. So this is my starting point. And then what can I build out of this? Let's see. Let's take this one and duplicate it and then modify it a little bit. So first of all, remember, if you're on the pen tool, we can add points, we can subtract points, and we can also, by using keyboard shortcuts, bend paths and so on. So this is kind of useful. Like here, for instance, I can hold Option. Notice that when I'm on the pen tool, it gives me the convert anchor point tool now, so I can curve this. If I hold Shift, it will curve slightly differently. But I'm going to hold it like that and create a curve. And I'm also going to keep that held down and drag this point up a little bit more. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another shape around here. We're now using the negative space here to create that. For the curve at the top, I'm going to add a little bit more curve here. Here I'm going to add a point and then pull it in using the direct selection tool. So I'm holding Command, that gives me the direct selection tool. I can pull that in. hold Option, I can then pull this back out again. And then I could pull this back out. So now we're sort of curving these shapes around. Here, if I wanted to, I can hold Option to give myself the anchor point tool so we could make this into a curve. Or the other way I could do it is I could curve it this way a little bit, then curve it this way a little bit, and we could form the curve that way. I'm going to pull this one down a little bit more. If I wanted to add a curve here, I could add a point and then use the Option key. So this is all on the pen tool and using those keyboard shortcuts. Command gives me the direct selection tool, so I can move points around or move handles around and so on. And then the Option key is giving me the convert anchor point tool, so I can change the angle of curves, take handles off to create corners, add handles by clicking and dragging and so on. And also change the direction of it. Here, if I wanted the knee to bend, I could add a point here, add a point here, select those 2 points and drag them out. If I wanted to make this bend, I could add a point here, add a point here, select through there and drag it out. And then if I wanted to round them, it's very easy to select over and just round those corners. Let's round that off a little bit. At the bottom here, maybe I want these feet to be rounded. So again, we could put I have an extra point there, which I don't really need, but I'll use that and drag that out. Again, holding Option, I can create a curve by using the convert anchor point tool. In the corner here, I'm just going to round the toe off here. And the same with the heel. Here, I could add a point, add another point, pull it in, and we've now created an offset where the shoe meets the foot. Again, I could hold Option, pull out a little curve for the leg so it has some form. So you can see how you can start to manipulate that. It's almost like doing sculpture, actually. You're starting with this very simplified form, and you gradually start to add detail into it. Another way to approach it is to build things out of a whole bunch of separate objects. So let's say like with that horse, for instance, I was showing you earlier, this silhouette of the horse. If I start off with some basic shapes, like for the body, for instance, I could do a shape like this. I'm going to rotate it a little bit. And I'm also going to drag this point up slightly. And then I'm going to put a circle on the back end. And then we'll put another rectangle here for the neck and rotate that. And then I'm going to do another rectangle and rotate that. This is a really nice feature that they've added with these live objects, so you can rotate it without having to change tools. If you're on a basic shape like the rectangle tool now, you simply drag out the shape, and then as soon as you've dragged it out, you have access to the ability to rotate it automatically. Again, using the pen tool, I can curve some of these shapes. So like on the horse, for instance, I want the horse's head to come down a little bit further. And I'm going to add a little bit of a curve on the front end. And then for the legs on a horse are basically split into 3 parts. There's the top, the bottom, and then in the middle you've got a knee, which is actually pretty prominent on the horse. It sort of stands out quite a lot. And then at the bottom, you've got a foot which is slightly offset forward like that. So if we start with that as a starting point, and then I unite this, we've got a big muscle group here at the front here. So I'm just going to add something in there for now. So let's say we add all this together. And then we take this point. I'm going to bring this one up a little bit. I'm going to bring this one over a little bit. I'm going to bring this over a little bit. And then here on the foot, I'm going to get rid of this point. This bit I'm going to curve in. This bit I'm going to curve out. This bit I'm going to curve in. This bit I'm going to curve out. This bit I'm going to curve out. You can always make them shorter and longer, of course, afterwards by selecting it. Like here for this leg, I can always maybe pull this up a little bit if it's too long. So I won't worry too much to begin with, even if the proportions are slightly off. You can always modify that. If I take a duplicate of this one, hold Option, duplicate it, and then chop his leg off. Sounds brutal, doesn't it? Chop his leg off. And then delete the body. We can use this one again. So maybe I want to take this, I'll chop him at the knee. And then on the knee part, I'm going to select the top, rotate it from the knee position like that. And then I'll put this other leg behind like he's up. Let's select this one. Click on the knee position, rotate it around a little bit more there. And then if I select these two, let's move this out slightly, unite it. There's a section in here which didn't quite work, obviously, where it connects, but we can easily fix that by going in and taking out anchor points. So I'm just deleting anchor points that are not necessary. Remember that the anchor point is holding the shape in that position. So if you delete it, it'll collapse it to a different place. And you can use that as a way to form the shapes that you want. You might even be able to use this same leg on the back side of it, at least as a starting point. So before I do that, I'm going to select this whole section through here. And then I'm going to choose the rotate tool and rotate it from that position back. There we go. So it's a bit more upright. But if I take this one again, duplicate it, chop his leg off. So again, using the knife tool, I just chop through here. It doesn't really matter if it's completely accurate because we can always modify it afterwards. These are just rough, like building it out. So here for the back leg, I'm going to have it go around about here. And then if we join this into here, I can get rid of shapes like this here needs to go back. This needs to go back. This needs to come forward. This needs to curve. Actually, this one needs to curve the other way. And we also need to have a little bit of a curve there. And then I can take this one out. This one is going to go inside now. So when you're doing this, by the way, I'm drawing this kind of made up out of my head, but it's actually a good idea to use reference for this kind of thing. I have actually recently, as part of that Microsoft project, I did an illustration for a, what do you call it? A Pegasus. And so I did actually have to spend some time looking at horses. So this isn't so difficult for me now because I've done it fairly recently. And actually when I was younger, I used to be really into drawing. So I would just find a thing like a horse and then try to figure out what you need to do to draw it. Look at the anatomy and look at examples of it and so on. But when you're working on your characters, if you need a reference, find reference, photographic reference, even if it's not going to end up looking precisely like that. It gives you an idea of how something's formed. Because you know, with the characters, you're going to abstract them, you're going to simplify them, you're going to exaggerate them. But it gives you some reference point, you know. Again, if I want to add details, I can add some points. I can pull out an ear from here. On the back here, I could add another point here, add another point here, add another point here. Drag this out a little bit. Create a little curve there. We can have this pull off of there. I'll add a point here. And then I option clicked on it to get rid of the handle. So this becomes a corner. And I'll add another point here. And I'll add another point here and another point here and drag this one back. Option click to get rid of the handles. And then I can curve this one on the inside. Also, I'll add a point there just to make it easier. You can see how you can start to then add the detail back into it. So we're starting with very simple forms, just squares, rectangles, and so on. and then gradually modifying it into something which is more complex by adding anchor points, moving anchor points around, adjusting corners so they're more rounded, and so on. For the tail, we could do something like we did before, where we use a brush. You know, we could draw out roughly where the tail is going to go. We could find a brush that was made, or we could find a brush that already exists, or we could use one of these shapes if we're using a stroke. So let's say this is just a stroke, and then we go in here and we choose a brush like this one, for instance, and then increase the size of it. We would then end up with a shape like this. Object, expand appearance. Object, simplify. So path, simplify, so that we can edit it more easily. And now I can go back in here and I can adjust this. Like this corner here is a little bit odd. Maybe I'll go in here and readjust that so that it's a better shape. You see how this has a bump? If I add a point either side of that bump and then take that point out, it'll help to smooth that out a little bit. So here I'm going to bring this down a little bit more like that and take this point out. And then once you've got your silhouette, if you wanted to continue it to make it a more complex form, we'll look at this in more detail later on. But once you've got the silhouette, basically how you want it, you can add more detail into it with just whites over the top. So let's take a look at this one, for instance. You could go back afterwards and you could just add areas of white, you know, so like maybe along here where I've got the neckline, I could draw a shape over the top of this. So I'm just going to draw a shape in outline mode so I can see what's going on here a little bit better. That goes kind of like this. So I'm just sort of following that curve. I'm going to go across there. And then I'm going to change this one to white. And I'm going to, with that selected, I'm going to lower the opacity so that we can see it better. And just so that you can see it disappear better, actually, for right now, I won't have it be white. I'll change it to white afterwards. But I want to get rid of the shape around here and only keep it in relationship to that curve. So basically, I'm going to select this shape and this shape. So this is a little bit confusing because I've also got the head the neck is a separate shape right now. So if I hide that, you can see it a little bit better, but maybe. So we've got the body, and then we've got this shape. And I want to have this bit become a highlight. So if I use the shape builder tool and option click to get rid of that, then I can change this to the highlight color and put that over the top. I'll bring back the neck. You can start going in and adding little highlights like that into it. So if I select this color again, on the nose, for instance, I could go in here and add a bit of a highlight over the top here. Maybe on this part of the face over here, we'll have a little bit more highlight. That's looking very strange indeed. You can start going in and adding elements into this, like little details into the illustration once you've got the silhouette created, and sort of gradually build it out. And then the other thing I want to talk about is the way that you could, once you've drawn the silhouette, is you could then divide it up. So I'm drawing these lines in red to make them clear, and it's actually kind of useful even if you're just doing this yourself, because it makes it easier for you to see what you're doing. When you're dividing the shape up, you want to make sure that the stroke that you're using to divide it is just a stroke and no fill. So if this also had a fill on it, when it divides through, it would divide through there, but it would also divide straight across there. So I want to make sure there's no fill on it. Now, if I divide this shape, I use Pathfinder Divide. It went to front because that last path was in front of this boot. So it went in front of this boot, which I've already colored. But that boot's just sitting on top of the full black shape. I'll get rid of that for now. So now if I bring up those other shapes, I've lost one here somewhere, but I'm going to make another shape here for the t-shirt. So it needs to start outside the shape and it needs to end outside the shape. It can actually end right on it. I just find it easier to end outside the shape because if you try to click it right on it, if you miss even very slightly by a millionth of a millimeter, it's not going to cut it. So I always just have it go outside either side. So now if I select this shape and divide it, we now have an area here which I can use as the t-shirt. I have one more division to make actually, which is going to be, I'll get my stroke color back. So we're going to have a division that goes through here. I was thinking that this already had the circular shape for the t-shirt neck, but it doesn't. So I'm going to cut this one. So we're going to cut this also here. Now we've divided it, we can change the color of this. So because that's a separate shape. Now, when I did that, one of the problems with the way that I'm doing this is that I now have a separate shape sitting next to another shape. So if I ever want to change the curve on this sleeve, I can't really because those two shapes would both have to be adjusted equally. Now you can do it, it just makes it more tricky. So if I move the t-shirt, I've also got to move the arm relative to it. So in that case, it wasn't too bad, but sometimes that can become a little bit tricky. So the other thing you can do is, instead of just dividing the shape, go back to the point where this isn't divided. What we can do is we can make a copy of the shape and paste it in front and then divide it. So I need to draw my path through here again. And again, this needs to be a stroke only. And then divide it. So now I have this sitting over the top of that one. I bring these to the top. Divide through here. We don't need that, but actually. So now I have this bit sitting on the top that we can adjust separately. That one actually didn't divide for some reason. I'll do that again in a second. Because this now sits on the top, if I want to adjust it, it makes it easier for me to adjust this. So for instance, if I wanted to adjust this position, all I need to do is remove that. But you can see that I still have the body underneath it. So if I move this, it's not like I'm leaving a hole behind. So that's the idea of making a copy and pasting in front first before you go ahead and do the divisions for the different areas. So just to recap this idea, the basic idea of what I'm talking about here is you begin with some simple shapes, build out the character from those simple shapes, and then modify the character to make it, to refine it further, just as a silhouette to begin with. So the idea of that is, first of all, it's easier, obviously, just to deal with black shapes. And so to start with, it gets you to a point where you've got the shape quickly. But also the final silhouette is important on the character. It's very important in terms of expressing it properly. So if you draw it as a black and white silhouette to begin with, you can really focus on just that aspect of how it works as a silhouette before you get into any of the details. Does that make sense? Okay, let me go back to the handout for the class. So the last thing I wanted to do is a demonstration. It's 2:30 already. I think I'm going to leave this actually because I'm already at like an hour and getting close to an hour and a half. On Wednesday, what I would like to do is I'd like to talk a little bit about sketching. So I'm going to do a very, very, very brief demo now, and I'll do a proper one on Wednesday because this is going to be the next step, is doing the sketches for this project. Before I get into that, let's just remind you. So by end of day today, you should have submitted the final version of Project One symbols. Just to clarify, because a couple of people had asked me questions about this, you're going to set this up so that it's 11 by 17. So if you go to Document, create a new document, choose Print. Tabloid is 11 by 17. So even though here it's set to points, if you were to change this to inches, it would be 11 by 17. We want it to be horizontal, so the orientation is this way. And then you might have thumbnail sketches, and I want to well, actually, you will have thumbnail sketches, and I want you to incorporate the thumbnail sketches in with the project that you turn in. So in the PDF that has the final version of the symbols, also put the thumbnail sketches. You could also upload those two things separately if you want to, but I'd rather have them both together. So you set it up. If you're doing thumbnails and you don't want to do it through Acrobat, you could do it in Illustrator by just adding the number of artboards you need for the number of thumbnails. So let's say you have 2 scans of thumbnails, pages of thumbnails. You could set up 3 artboards, 1 for your symbols, and then 2 for your 1 for your symbol and 2 for the thumbnail sketches. You can always move these artboards around, by the way, if you want to. So I could put this one down here instead, so you have one after the other. But when it exports as a PDF, if I was to view it in Acrobat anyway, they would view one after each other. And then when you're setting up the symbols to show them, to present them, remember that they should all occupy roughly the same amount of space. The way that I would suggest that you start off is draw a rectangle that's 11 by 17. So the same size as the document. Then go to Object, Path, Offset Path. Offset it by -1 inch. You can delete the original rectangle. This one you can make into a guide, Command 5. And then draw a grid inside of here using the rectangle tool and drag it out like this. So this should be 5 squares across and then 3 down. Oops, didn't quite get it. So if I start here and then go across like this, I can then make this into a guide, Command 5, or View Guides Make, and then each of my symbols will go in here. And they should all be, as I said, they should all be roughly the same size, same visual weight. So they might be quite radically different in terms of what they're representing, but they should feel like they belong together as a family. They should have some white space around them so that we can see each individual symbol separately, as well as seeing them as a set. So this is how you should have your symbols set up, basically. And then you're obviously going to have more than this. So these are all going to be different, of course, but roughly set up like that, okay? So they could vary a little bit if they're a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller, it doesn't really matter, but that sort of structure, all right? 5 across, 3 down, so you got your 15 symbols, however many pages of thumbnail sketches afterwards. And then you have until midnight tonight to turn that one in for grading, okay? Remember, as long as you turn it in for grading, you can have up until the end of the semester for a change of grade. So even if you're not completely happy with it, turn something in, for goodness sake, because you can always go back and make changes for a better grade later on. If you don't turn anything in, then you're going to forfeit the right to make changes for a better grade, and you'll automatically lose points for it being late, okay? The other thing that's due is the tracing selfie. I can't see your name now, because let me get out of sharing screen. Oh, Rosemary's got a really nice one. I'm gonna show a couple of these, and then on Wednesday we'll show them better.
Where'd your class go?
Let me go to assignments, and then
I
go
was able to actually get mine uploaded.
You weren't able to?
I figured it out. It's
Oh, yeah, I can see it now. Actually, yeah. So what was it because it was RG? Was it because it was CMYK? Do you think?
No. So I did the process through Zoom itself, but once I came back, it didn't show up. So
Right.
I actually went into like the video settings. If you look at where it says like start video or turn video off, there's a little upward arrow, and if you click on that, you can select Zoom settings, and then from there you can go into profile, and then there's edit my profile, and then you can change it like while you're inside of the meeting.
Explain that to me again real quick, because I wasn't in Zoom when you were saying it and I missed it.
Sorry, so go to start video or stop video and click the upward facing arrow in the upper left hand corner of the box.
In Zoom.
In Zoom, yeah. And then there's a video settings option. So you select the video settings option.
Uh-huh.
And then on the left hand side, there's like general video audio. Go all the way down to where it says profile. Click on profile, and then there's edit my profile.
I don't see that.
Yeah.
I don't see where you're looking then. Is it on the left-hand side?
Do you have the settings box open?
Hang on, I'm going to share my screen. Can you see it now?
Yeah, so go down to profile. It's like up 4 from there. Edit my profile. And then it'll...
When you were doing it before, you just weren't doing it from here.
Yeah, I was doing it from Zoom itself. So I opened the box here, and then you sign into your Zoom, and it gives you like another option in the back. So
yeah, I've done it before. I don't know. Here I can just click here, and then I can edit it, right? Change picture.
Oh yeah, that works too.
Yeah, I think that's the way I did it before. Is I just click here where that pencil icon is, and then edit it.
Oh yeah, that seems easier, but both ways.
I was gonna show yours because I think you did a really good job on this one.
Thank you.
So this is the exercise, remember, from last week, if you haven't already done it. So again, even if for some reason you missed this and you're like, wait, what? Do something before midnight so you get it turned in on time. You can always redo it for a better grade later on. This one is not as many points as the other one, but it's a great exercise for you to do. It really helps you to kind of get to grips with learning the pen tool. And it also is a useful thing in terms of design for thinking about how you simplify something which is made out of very subtle transitions of tone and express that change of tone over a surface with just flat colors. That idea of how you simplify it is really important. You did a great job. Thanks, Rosemary.
Thanks.
This is Jordan's project. Who else has turned it in? This is Anna's project. And then this was Hannah's project. So on this one, just to give you a kind of gauge, I gave Hannah 2 on this one because I felt like, although she's simplifying it kind of well, there's areas where she's not really looking at the photograph. And like, for instance, here, this shadow is actually in the wrong place altogether. It's really in a different part of the neck. And so it sort of distorts it in a sort of weird way. So what I'm looking for is for you to really look at the photograph and analyze it. I do want you to simplify it, you know, but, and you can decide to some extent how much simplification you want to employ. But I also want you to stay true to the photograph and really trace what you see on the photograph and focus on those beautiful curves that you can create with the pen tool. Okay. All right, very quickly. I'm just going to do a very quick idea of how to use to do the sketches for the character project, and then we're going to take off. And I'll do a better demonstration of this on the Wednesday class, but I feel like it's already gone on long enough right now. So first of all, if you're going to create anything, you do a sketch. Pretty much anything you see in the world that exists, a phone, a car, a building, whatever, was sketched first. That's how everything begins. And so sketching is a really useful tool. I think it's undervalued in the educational system, actually. I think that students should be encouraged to sketch just as much as they're encouraged to learn to read and write. It's a general form of communication. When we're doing characters, just like with most drawing, you want to start simple and then gradually get more complicated. Forget about detail altogether to begin. All we're going to focus on is main shapes. So let's say you're doing a head. You're just going to block in the basic shape. Now I'm using a pencil tool here. It's being a bit weird actually. I'm using a pencil tool here, which is, if you're on the, this is in Photoshop. If you're on the brush tool, at the top here in the brushes, we have a set of groups of brushes, these folders of brushes. So you got the general brushes, then you have these dry media brushes. So I'm going to start off by using this Ultimate Pencil Hard. By the way, if I was drawing on paper, I would never use a hard pencil for sketching. I would use a soft pencil. Something like a 2B or even a 4B pencil is generally what I use for sketching. But in these Kyle's brushes, the one that I like to use for sketching is this hard pencil. And then basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to very roughly, by layering line after line over the top of each of them, I'm going to sort of help to modulate the form. I'm going to try and feel out where is this thing that I'm trying to draw? Where's this character? You know? It's Michelangelo was famously quoted as saying that the sculpture, I think it's Michelangelo, maybe it was Rodin actually, that was, said that the sculpture is already in the piece of stone, and that his job is just to cut away the stone to what's left, just leave what's left, and then you've got the sculpture. And I think in some ways when you're drawing, what you're basically doing is you're just sort of chipping away at finding the image that's sort of there, you know? So obviously it helps, this sort of goes without saying, it obviously helps when you're drawing if you've practiced drawing a lot in your life. And so some people are going to be better at this process than other people. Some people will find it more comfortable than other people because they haven't done it as much. Or some people will find it more comfortable, I should say, because they've done it so much. Whereas other people find it more uncomfortable because they don't have that same comfort level with drawing. Also, obviously, some people are just better at drawing. It's, you know, the nature of things. Some people are very good at this. Some people are not so good at it. But the process is a fairly logical one, and I do believe that anybody can learn to draw well. It's something. I don't think it's necessarily down to like a skill that you're necessarily born with, although that may be true to some extent. Who knows? But certainly, you can practice and get a lot better at drawing over time, without a doubt. So these lines are just sort of feeling things out. If you're drawing a whole character, again, think about the silhouette. I'm going to make my brush a little bit bigger for right now. So if I'm drawing a character, I might begin by going, okay, so the shoulders are going to go here, the spine is going to go here, the hips are going to go here, the head's going to go right around back here somewhere. I'm going to have the arms come out like this, makes them feel more masculine. Same with the legs slightly spread out, makes them more masculine. The body. So you start off with a basic structural form, you know? And then you might go, well, actually, I want his legs to be more bowed, make his head a little bit bigger. So I'm going to come back to this on Wednesday because the class is going to go on too far. But when you're doing the thumbnail sketches for this project, you can do them on paper. You can do them in Photoshop with a Wacom tablet. You can do them on an iPad. It doesn't really matter how you're doing it. You're going to create a kind of free form illustration. Quit some of these. Hopefully it'll free up in a second. So when you're doing these sketches, the important thing is that you're sort of just exploring and figuring out what the character should look like. What I was going to do after this, if we had a little bit more time, and I'll go over it on Wednesday, is using the layers in Photoshop. This is one of the reasons why I generally do my sketches these days digitally rather than on paper, although I actually do sometimes still do sketches on paper. I generally sketch using an iPad, and on Wednesday I'll do a demonstration with Procreate of sketching in Procreate as well as sketching in Photoshop. But the main thing is that if you're working digitally, you can use layers. So you can do a sketch, then you can lower the opacity on that layer, and then you can go over the top of it and refine it more. And then you can go over that and refine it further. Like, so generally the process for me for these sketches is I do a sketch, and then I make a new layer, lower the opacity on it so I can just see it, then draw over the top of it and refine it, then I lower the opacity on that one, do another layer, refine it further, and then get more and more detail. I also want to show you a process on Wednesday where we can take the sketch itself, put it into Illustrator, image trace it, and then color that directly. So rather than drawing in Illustrator, we're drawing it all basically by hand, cleaning it all up and everything. And then image tracing it in Illustrator to make it a vector, and then we'll use a couple of different techniques for how we could color that afterwards. All right, does anybody have questions? Are you all good? I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. All right, so don't forget to turn in your projects that need to be turned in. And then if you have questions, there's going to be a lab from, time is it now, 2:41. We'll do it from 3:30 till 5:30 today. There'll be a lab where you can just come in, and if you need help, I'll help you individually if you need help with anything. So maybe it's something that needs to be turned in today, or maybe it's for this. Or you might just have questions. The other thing is, if you want to, you can always set up a meeting with me one-on-one if you need to, where we can just go over anything that you're behind with, you're struggling with, okay? And then if nobody has any questions, I will see you guys on Wednesday. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.